Greetings and welcome to Flanigan's Ecologic. I am your host, Ted Flanigan, and today I'm delighted to have Farhad Abasov on the podcast. Since 2023, he's been the chairman, director, and co-founder of Millennial Potash. We're going to be speaking about potash. Prior to that, he was the head of Millennial Lithium. In fact, he's been the head of 8 different companies. He is really a global citizen. He's joining us from Dubai, where it's about 9 o'clock in the evening. I know his company is headquartered in Vancouver, British Columbia, and we'll talk a little bit more about his background. He holds an MBA from the International University in Japan. You can see this guy has been around. Farhad, welcome to the podcast. Very nice to meet you.
Great to meet you, Ted, as well, and great to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
And where were you born and raised before we get into the meat of the matter?
Yeah, I like that question, Ted. Someone asked me, where are you from? It's a long answer, so I'm going to keep it brief. But I'll keep it short. I was born and raised in Baku, Azerbaijan, and as you already mentioned, I got my master's. I got my bachelor's there. I got my master's in Japan, of all places, but we ended up in Canada. So most of my, I would say the bulk of my career was built in Canada. So first in power business, then of course in mining.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, let's jump right in and talk about potash. I admit I know very little about potash, and I think most of our listeners know very little about potash. And to do so, we need to talk a little bit about the chemistry of fertilizers for agriculture, and NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And potash is a form of potassium that is mined and manufactured, chiefly potassium carbonate. It's considered the king of fertilizers. Am I hitting it about right?
Yeah, pretty much, Ted. As I always say, people don't go to bed thinking about potash, so that's perfectly right. Normal. Perfectly normal that a lot of people are not aware of what it is, and sometimes we're having a discussion the other day, and people couldn't even pronounce it. They were saying potash, and so forth. But so again, it's normal because again, it's not a topic that you discuss all day long, or even you see on TV. So I'm glad that you actually invited me so that we can talk about potash and talk about the importance of it. But since you touched on what it is, you're absolutely right. So the chemical formula is KCl, which stands for potassium of chloride. So it's it is a kind of salt. So if you remember, going back to our chemistry class at high school, so NaCl stands for, for salt, in the regular table salt, whereas
sodium chloride,
exactly, right? Sodium chloride versus potassium chloride. So it is kind of salt. And when we talk about geology, you'll see that actually it almost always comes with salt in deposits as well. So it makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. And it is mostly used as a fertilizer. It is mined, and it is one of the most important fertilizers alongside with phosphate and nitrogen, as you mentioned. And when you say NPK, K stands for potash. Now you'll say why K when it's potassium and potash? Because K comes from Latin, and also they use it in German and in many other languages as Kali or Kalium. So that's why K that's where K comes from for potash or potassium. So when you say NPK, that is actually, you can use potash as part of that blended fertilizer type called NPK, and we call it blended fertilizer. Literally, you take those three, you blend it, you mix it, and then you apply it to the soil. But you can also directly apply potash to soil. So it is called the king of fertilizers, primarily because it strengthens plants. It helps with yield. It actually helps with the water retention and so forth. And most importantly, a lot of people kind of don't understand it or don't appreciate it much, but it also helps with soil that gets depleted of its nutrients and potash itself. So, obviously, most soils or most soil types in the world, they already have potassium in it or potash in it. But as you farm these lands, and obviously, some of these farmlands have been in use for centuries, if not thousands of years, right? We go back to Middle East or Eastern Europe or Central Asia. I mean, we've been cultivating those lands for forever. They get depleted of their nutrients. So it's important to obviously apply potash to replenish those.
Very good. And I think you have a huge mission, which is basically feeding the world's growing population, right? I mean, you're suggesting that not just potash, but other forms of fertilizers are essential for global food security, right?
Absolutely, Ted. I mean, and we're happy to see that a lot of large players and most importantly governments actually come to that same conclusion. For many years, and a lot of people didn't look at potash or phosphate and other fertilizers as critical minerals. But in the last few years, Western governments started taking it very seriously. For example, Canada added potash to its critical minerals list a few years back, and the U.S. Followed this suit last year, so they added it to their critical minerals list as well. So what that means is, Ted, is that now it is also considered a strategic material, a strategic mineral, a strategic commodity, because it's directly linked to food security. Without having these key fertilizers, basically your productivity, your agricultural productivity goes down, and that obviously directly affects your ability to feed your population. So it's not just food security per se. That translates into actual national security as well.
Right.
So and if you look across the globe right now, Ted, I mean, you see obviously this is not just about a potash, but there's a lot of what they call reshoring or resource nationalism and so forth. So a lot of countries come to a conclusion that, look, we do need to put food on the table before we start thinking about how to make weapons. So that's
pretty fundamental.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you mentioned that potash is naturally occurring in soils, or potassium is naturally occurring in soils. The soils get depleted. But then in terms of the rich deposits, and I think, it's only in certain countries, right? I mean, you got Canada is the largest potash, have the largest potash resources. And then you go to Russia and Belarus and others that are less politically stable, or in terms of accessible for the most part. Is that really the gist of it, that we've got? There are large reserves, but they are only in certain places, and so the trick is to mine them and then be able to distribute them around the world.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, Ted. That's exactly what it is. I call it geographically concentrated deposits. So in other words, it's not like gold or copper, where you find them in many other jurisdictions. Because of geological formation or development, you have these what they call evaporite basins or potash basins in certain countries. Now, just in a nutshell, the way they developed over millennia or millions of years, basically we had ancient seas or trapped lakes or trapped sea water bodies, and they evaporated over time. Yeah. And then once they evaporate, different types of salt actually form, and potash is one of them. So that's why you see them, for example, in Saskatchewan, in Canada, one of the largest potash-bearing basins in the world, of course, in the Urals, in Russia and Belarus and so forth. There's some other potash basins or deposits in the world as well, but those three countries are the largest producers, and they provide almost 70% of the world's potash. And when you think about it, you understand that how important it is, or how strategic potash has become, because basically about half a dozen countries provide all the world's potash, and all of the world uses potash. So in other words, if you look at major users of potash, almost all of them are net importers, and some of them don't have any domestic production of potash. So it has become critical for many countries now.
Yeah, it makes sense. And then the biggest importers, U.S., China, Brazil, is that right?
Exactly. And I would add India to it as well.
Okay.
So, and if you look at all those countries that you just mentioned, Ted, I'll just go through them quickly. U.S. has almost no domestic production, minuscule. So they import almost everything from Canada. But believe it or not, despite all the geopolitical tension with Russia, last year the U.S. imported about 1 million tons from Russia. So that's how important potash is. If you look at Brazil, 13 million tons used, and all of it is imported. China, they import almost 10 million tons. They do have some domestic production, but that's not enough for their domestic consumption. So they import another 10 million tons on top of their domestic production. And India, obviously, as you can imagine, also an extremely large country in terms of population. And they import about 5 million tons, zero domestic production. So that's how dire the situation is in terms of supply demand.
Right. And now you're throwing out these millions of tons that are large numbers. How does that compare to the world's reserves or resources of potash? I mean, do we have hundreds of millions of tons that have been discovered already, or thousands of millions of tons? What is the sort of the big volume number that we have?
Now, I'm glad you put that in that context, Ted, so that people understand how much potash there is. So I'll put it out there right away. There's no shortage of potash. It's just, as I mentioned, geographically concentrated in certain jurisdictions. So we have billions of tons of potash.
Billions of tons.
Billions of tons. So, for example, our project, we just started, as you mentioned, we started basically 2 years ago. Millennial Potash started developing its Gabon project. And we already have 6 billion tons in the ground at 15%. That's measured, indicated, and inferred. And this is only 5% of the project. Now, this is already considered a very large deposit, so that it's not, there are not too many of such deposits in the world that have billions of tons. But for example, if you look at large producers out of Canada, out of Russia, or Belarus, they would have billions of tons of.
So you would say, just to make it pretty simple for somebody like me, you would say we have thousands of years of supply of potash?
I would say so, Ted. Definitely for centuries and centuries.
Centuries and centuries. Yeah. Okay. And
So
just so I understand your role in Millennial Potash, because I don't understand how you've started 8 different companies in your lifetime. That's very impressive to me. But I take it you're at the very front end of development. In other words, you're developing. We're going to talk about this project in Gabon, but you're developing the project, and then you would sell the company on. Is that how you operate?
Ted, normally speaking, yes. Sometimes we take it all the way to production.
Yeah.
Depending on a number of factors, like CapEx requirements, the jurisdiction, the situation with that particular commodity. But normally speaking, our strengths lie at what we call at exploration/development stage.
Okay.
So that's when you take an early stage project that has quite a big promise, meaning that it has some sort of upside potential, meaning that you can actually drill it out, explore it further, and prove a very large resource. And then you can prove its economics, meaning that it's economically viable.
Yeah.
And then bring it to the point where it's ready to go in construction. And at that point, we usually sell it to a larger mining company, usually from that particular, produces that commodity, because we believe, they're better positioned to actually build and operate versus us. Of course, as I mentioned, in some instances in the past, for example, we had a uranium project. Actually, it was in the US that we built and started operations. We ended up selling that company as well. But in that particular case, we could get all the way to production.
So you've developed, uranium mining operations, lithium, and now potash. Are there other minerals that I should add to that list?
Yeah, we've done 2. This is our 3rd potash project. So Ted, we had a uranium project. We had a couple of lithium projects. We had geothermal. That was a private company that we developed. Again, the same idea. We took it from exploration all the way to the point where it was ready to go into production. We sold it actually to another company to do that. But I would say our advantages, our real strengths and skill sets reside in these. I would say industrial commodities, industrial minerals. So of course we can do precious metals too, the gold, silver, etc. But that's not where we specialize.
Okay, so how did you know that there were large resources or reserves of potash in Gabon?
So that's a great question, Ted. So what we do, normally speaking, we don't look for a specific commodity to start with. In other words, we start from a macro picture. We look at a macro view of what's happening in the world. Obviously in the mining world, we want to look at what's going on with several commodities, where the demand is coming from, what the obvious demand drivers are, but also whether there are going to be any kind of issues with supply, what the geopolitical situation is. And then we see an interesting opportunity, meaning the supply demand picture is actually pretty positive going forward. We try to find a project that has already seen some sort of previous exploration, and in a jurisdiction that is acceptable to us. So that's how we do it. Now with Gabon, actually we had known about this project, but we didn't get involved with it because we're very busy with our Millennial Lithium project. This was a project in Argentina, and then. But eventually, once we sold Millennial Lithium, we started with the Gabon project. So we knew quite a bit about it because it had been explored in the past. There was quite a bit of work done on it. So we knew that it would have tremendous potential. And one other thing that we liked about Gabon, which was important, of course, if not more important than the project, was the country itself. So it was a stable jurisdiction, was very supportive of mining. And this project happens to be right on the coast too, Ted, which is very, very unusual, because if you look at those large projects that I mentioned earlier in Russia and Canada, they're smack in the middle of continents. So a lot harder logistics versus this one, which is right on the coast, so we can take it out
And you're
relatively.
and you're literally building a port there to export
Exactly.
this
The
material
port
right out of
is
there.
under construction as we speak. Exactly.
So how do
that's
you
a huge advantage.
backing up a little bit? Okay, so you find out that there's a large opportunity here. Do you, Farhad, do you go there and meet with the national leaders, or do you go there and do you purchase land or lease the land? How does that work? By the way, I think I'm right that your facility there or your land holding there is half the size of the state of Rhode Island in the United States. We're talking about a pretty major operation, right?
That's a good actual comparison. I never thought about it, actually positioning or framing like that. But you're absolutely right. It's pretty large. If you compare, you're absolutely right. When I think about it, Rhode Island's, land is probably about what 2,500, 2,600 square kilometers. Correct?
I did my homework. 2678
yes.
square
So this
kilometers.
is almost exactly half of it. You're absolutely right, Ted. Because
Yeah.
so it's crazy how big it is. You're absolutely,
Yeah.
When you put it that way, it's actually even more impressive. But the good question you asked, Ted. So it depends on who we're buying this project from. So sometimes we go and deal exactly as you described with the government. In other words, it is on the government's balance sheet, meaning the Ministry of Mines usually has this. And you have to go and apply for a mining permit, and you go through the whole, not mining in this case, but exploration permit. So you go through that process. But in many cases, someone already owns it. In other words, it's already a private company, whether it's a local company or international company. So you go and deal with them. In other words, but before you strike a deal with them, Ted, you just mentioned exactly right. We go there. We go there, we check out the project, we go and talk to the government, we'll go talk to a lot of other operators who have been there for a while, just to understand what we're looking at, not only as far as project is concerned, but also as far as the operating environment is concerned. Because one thing that you read about it, you hear what the officials are saying, it's almost always positive, but want to go and find out, what else is there. So, uncover as much material as possible so that we can make an assessment as to whether we can work there or not.
Right. And I'm sure that the country is thrilled to have that form of economic development. But I'm going to take a little bit off on my environmental side of me, saying, well, this is a lot like strip mining, isn't it? Coal mining or strip mining of coal.
It's very different, Ted.
Oh, it is very different.
Oh, it's very different. I'm happy you asked that question. But that is a main difference. No, this is so. Just maybe take a step back. So there are two ways of extracting potash. So if you look at today's supply of potash, so about 70% of it comes from what we call conventional underground operations. So you can imagine this, sinking a shift underground, then you go laterally, horizontally to mine it and so forth. It's a very conventional. A lot of people know what it is. And then there's the solution mining. About 30% of potash supply comes from solution mining. But solution mining is a lot more elegant approach. It has the minimal environmental impact. It has, and it also costs less, meaning that you basically drill into your deposit, you pump water underground, and can be salt water, for example. We can pump seawater. You dissolve potash underground because potash is dissolvable very easily, and then you pump that brine back up to the surface, and you go through processing. So when you think about it, unlike underground operations, etc., there's no safety issue. No one is going down. Everyone is up. There's no subsidence issues. There are no sinkhole issues. Nothing like that. And when you look at surface of that type of an operation, you will never guess that it's a mining operation because there's nothing going on. There's all you see is just there's this pipes sticking out with gauges attached to them, the well heads and so forth. It looks more like a natural gas operation because you're not really digging up anything. So that's a big difference because with underground or conventional operations, obviously you have a tremendous impact on the environment, especially where we are in Gabon. It's in the middle of jungle, so we want to have as little impact as possible for obvious reasons. So with solution mining, you avoid a lot of these issues.
Well, now you mentioned you kind of got ahead of me there, but I was going to ask you about water. But you're saying you can use seawater to do that, to create the solution, but then you pump it up and you must have to evaporate that water off it, right?
Correct. Yeah, you evaporate that water.
Settling ponds or something like that?
So no, it's a little bit different. So it really, but you're absolutely right. In some instances where climate permits, you can actually have evaporation ponds. Now, for example, we had a project in Ethiopia, in East Africa, where climate was pretty harsh, but also it was very hot. So year round, you had 40, 45 degrees Celsius, so you could operate solar evaporation ponds. So that's what they do, for example, in countries like Israel and Jordan, where they kind of, because of the climate, that's how they extract it from the Dead Sea. Now, in our case, we are in the western part of Africa, so it's pretty humid. Half of the year it rains. So we cannot really use solar evaporation ponds. So what we do, we use what they call thermal evaporators. So literally, we just use thermal power to evaporate water. So these are large cauldrons, and basically you use natural gas, whatever cheap energy source you have, to evaporate water. So that's our approach. But you're absolutely right. In some places, you can use solar evaporation ponds as well.
And so in Gabon, you're going to be using natural gas. Is that right?
Sorry, say it again.
In Gabon, you will be using natural gas?
Yeah, exactly. So Gabon is a big oil producer, and they have obviously a lot of natural gas there as well. So we'll be using natural gas, so because it's probably the cheapest way of actually, evaporating water to evaporate water.
And I guess I don't really understand like what kind of volumes. It sounds like a lot of natural gas that you would need in order to evaporate that many millions of pounds of millions of tons, of your potash solution, right?
Yeah. So you don't have to evaporate all of that water, Ted. So in other words, what happens is you evaporate enough, but you still take that brine for further processing, and the further drying happens down the road. So yeah, but you do need we'll need our power plant. The power that we need there, power requirements will be about 25 megawatts. So just because most of it will be used exactly for evaporation. Obviously, we'll use it for other parts of the facility and other parts of the production process and processing, but most of it will be used for evaporation.
Well, 25 megawatts doesn't sound like very much to me.
No, it's not. It's not like massive. We're not going to be using 200, 300. It's really for the size of production that we have envisioned to start with. We're going to be using 25 megawatts.
Right. All right. Okay. And then when you load up your ships, your freighters to take the potash off to wherever it's going, India or South America or North America. Is it in that brine solution? Is it a liquid that you're loading onto the ship, or is it
no? At that point,
No,
it will be dry product at that point, Ted. So basically, what you do, once you basically extract potash and separate it from salt and other elements. Frankly, there's not much other things. It's mostly salt and potash. So once you separate potash from salt, you dry it up, and it's ready basically to be shipped. So it is shipped in a dry form. So it's just a dry bulk commodity.
Now, how do the people on the ground? I mean, I can imagine the government is excited about bringing in this form of this new revenue source to the country. Are you disrupting cultures there? You said you're in the middle of the jungle. I don't know. Are there a lot of people that live there that are going to be impacted?
That's a very important question, Ted. And this is one of the key questions that we'll look at, or key aspects we'll look at before we get involved with the project. Here, I mean, you're absolutely right. The government is excited about it. Gabon is a small country, less than 2 million people. So here we deal mostly with the central government. With the president's quite excited. The president's office, of course, the Minister of Mines, they're all supportive of this project as well. And locally, where we are, there's no population around us. So the nearest populated area is about 50 kilometers away. So there's no real direct impact per se on them because we're not drawing water from them or power or anything like that. Having said that, we do employ quite a few people from there. So it has a lot of positive impact. There's not a lot going on in that part of Gabon, meaning in terms of industry, agriculture, and so forth. So once in production, we're going to be the largest industrial project there. So probably the largest employer as well. So that's why this is now one of the top priority projects for the country, Ted. And that's one of the reasons that, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that the U.S. Development Finance Corporation actually is supporting our project. They're providing financing for our feasibility study, which is a big thing for us.
How long does it take to get from, start to finish here? Finish, I guess, being a fully operable mine.
Correct. So Ted, on average, it depends, of course, on different projects. It may take from 3 to 10 years, because some of the large projects, for example, underground mining, etc., it takes many, many years to actually get to the point where it's the project is online. But in our case, we're already done with exploration. So in the last 2 years, we've been doing exploration. Now we just announced yesterday, actually, that we're starting our definitive feasibility study. So we're already at the development stage, and that will last probably for the next 12 to 14 months, because we're also running environmental and social impact studies along the feasibility study. Now, once those two programs are done, so we need to obviously put financing together, which we're working on as well. And as I mentioned, USDFC is also supportive, so they will be helping us with putting together a financing package. So the thing is that by early next year, we should be in a position to have financial close. And by the middle of 2027, we should be able to start construction. So realistically, this project can be in production, I would say, by the end of 2028, early 2029.
Oh, really? Okay. And you're based right now in Dubai, right?
Correct. Yes.
And is that because you need to go down to Gabon?
No, I've been based there for quite a few years, so it wasn't just related to this potash. So this is kind of a, because we had other projects in Africa, so it was kind of easier, spot. The connectivity in Dubai is a lot better with Africa and so forth. I remember when we started with our project in Ethiopia, I was based in Toronto, and it was a nightmare to travel because there were no direct flights. And I remember that I moved my family to Europe first because we thought it would be easier. As soon as I moved to Europe, they actually started direct flights between Toronto and Addis. so things happen, but it was a positive development. But yeah, I hear basically it's primarily because it's easier connectivity to Europe, to Africa, but also there's a lot of interest coming from the Gulf countries. There's a new industrial strategy from several Gulf countries, and Africa is one of their cornerstone strategies, meaning that there's quite a bit of focus on developing specifically the mining industry in Africa. So it makes a lot of sense to be based there. Although it was, again, originally that was not the intention, but over time it's developed here, so it's a good place to be. Right.
Fascinating. Yeah. I mentioned at the top that the podcast is focused on sustainability solutions, and I've had quite a few episodes have focused on agriculture, and several people that have been on the podcast have been talking about regenerative agriculture. And I just wanted to get your impression of that, because I think that those folks would say that the mining of potash, the extractive sort of economy, shipping these materials all over the world is far from a sort of a sustainable solution. And that, what we really ought to be doing is revamping agriculture, our agricultural practices, and moving towards this regenerative agriculture, which works on building the soil, the life of the soil, the biome beneath the surface, bringing livestock together with crop production. What's your reaction to that line of thinking, that side of the agricultural equation?
Ted, I'm glad you raised this question, and I'm not going to pretend that I know much about regenerative agriculture. Obviously, I've read about it and I talk to people about it and so forth. Sure. I'm not an agronomist, although we do have an agronomist on our board, Mark Stouffer, who knows everything from inside and out, and knows obviously a lot about the use of fertilizer, specifically potash and phosphate too. But what I'll say that I think there's room for both. I mean, for sure, we have to make sure that we actually handle all our agricultural lands, and I don't think people pay enough attention to it. But we need to handle them with utmost care, because as I mentioned early on, we do get tremendous soil depletion worldwide. Maybe not as much in the West, but if you look at Chinese soil quality, or India, or the Middle East and so forth, I mean, we have tremendous issues there. And so, yes, of course, you do need to come up with new technologies, new approaches, etc. But I think that by the time you do that, you still, while you're doing that, you still have to feed people. So you still have to make sure that the agricultural lands are actually productive enough so that we can afford all the food. So I think it's critical that we continue with production and, of course, application of fertilizers such as potash. Now, having said that, you're absolutely right. There's another dimension to it, how we extract these commodities, right? So we're still in mining. So I always say potash and phosphate are unique commodities where we straddle both. We straddle, mining as well as agriculture. So I think the key thing is to be responsible, and that's why we talked about solution mining. That's one part of it, and also it's the whole gamut of operations. It's not just the extraction part; it's how you treat everything around it. So as long as I think companies take on that responsibility to be sustainable and most importantly responsible, I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of work hand in hand. And there are quite a few organizations actually that they're trying to achieve that goal as well. We're not one of them, of course. We're focused specifically on one project, but generally speaking, industry-wide organizations that are trying to make sure that this, the agriculture is as productive and as sustainable as possible.
Yeah, I think it's a great answer to my question. And in fairness, I think the regen agriculture movement, the organic agriculture movement, is probably just 1%, maybe 2% of all agriculture worldwide. And as we said back several minutes ago, we have this mission of feeding this world's, we have about 7 billion people on the planet. The population is going to grow to 12 billion by 2050. We need to feed the world's population. So I'm glad that you have you're taking a balanced approach. Sounds like you sound like a very busy man, and I like to end the podcast with just a personal question. You look happy, healthy. You're obviously doing well in your career. We've talked a little bit about family before we jumped on. How do you maintain a work-life balance?
Well, I got a very bad news, Ted, for viewers out there.
You don't. You just don't.
There's very little of it, to be honest. I mean, I always, it's funny because my kids obviously watch me, see me, doing work, etc. So they're fully aware of it, and they always, every time they talk to their friends, how it is, their work-life balance. Yeah. They always come back to me and say, "Dad, have you heard of this concept at all?" I say, "Yes, I have." And I hear that it's a very good concept. I mean, the reality of it is that, Ted, there's very little balance, unfortunately. Of course, we're trying to balance it with some time off, etc. I mean, not only, it's not just the nature of this business, meaning of this industry, it's also because we're a small company. So, in other words, in a smaller company, it's very difficult to balance a lot of things, meaning that you cannot really delegate a lot of things. I mean, we have only a handful of people who operate at the highest level. And we always say, and I'll leave it on that note, holiday is when you work from somewhere else. So
Good answer.
Well, but I would greatly advise that young generations take work-life balance more seriously. I think our generation is kind of past that, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, take your vitamins, Farhad.
yes, exactly. We have to.
Thanks so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate your time and educating us about this.
Thank you so much, Ted. Great to be here and great talking to you.
That's it. Thanks for listening to Flanigan's EcoLogic. We'll see you next time.